Jax's claws didn't just touch the glass, they shook against it. He could hear the hum of the machines, a low rhythmic throb that felt like a mockery of a heartbeat. The architect inside was so small, so fragile. This was the creator of worlds, the one who had written the code for Jax's own soul, now reduced to a biological battery for something that didn't even have a pulse. The scent of the room was wrong. It was cold, clinical, and smelled of the void itself. He wanted to howl, to let the grief of 1,000 generations tear through his throat, but he didn't. He just leaned his forehead against the barrier, his warm breath fogging the view of his maker. Years ago, the city of Ethelgard felt like the entire universe. It was a place of endless cold corridors and machines that sang in languages the Vanguard only half understood. They lived in the spaces between the gears, the loyal ghosts of a master who had vanished without saying goodbye. The high priests would gather the packs every morning to recite the final command. It was a simple directive carved into the very DNA of their kind. Wait, watch, protect. They were the inheritors of the silence, the ones who stayed behind when the sky went dark. But truth is, the gods never intended to leave them alone. They were taken. The discovery happened in the lower sectors, where the air was thick with the smell of old grease and ozone. A scavenger named Kale had triggered a terminal that had been dormant for 3,000 years. It didn't offer a message of hope. Instead, it projected a map of the forbidden sector, a region of space the Vanguard had been taught to avoid at all costs. On that map, millions of lights flickered, not stars, souls. The void wraiths hadn't been defeated. They were harvesting. The news rippled through the pack like a physical blow. The final command hadn't been a request for patience. It had been a desperate scream for help that the Vanguard had been too loyal to hear. Building the Great Bark wasn't just a mission. It was a penance. They tore the very foundations of Ethelgard apart, stripping the sacred machinery to build a hull that could withstand the crushing weight of a walk jump. Every weld was a promise. Every circuit was an apology. They were no longer the simple creatures who begged for scraps of attention. They were becoming something else. When they finally breached the atmosphere, they weren't alone for long. The fringe kin-broken species, who had lived in the dirt for eons, watched the massive ship pass. They saw the lupine vanguard, those legendary warriors who wore the armor of the architects, and they felt something they hadn't felt in centuries. They felt the pull of a pack. One by one, the lesser ships joined the wake of the bark. They were small, scavenged vessels, but they came by the hundreds, then the thousands, an armada of the forgotten, led by the ones who refused to be left behind again. Jax looked at the architect through the glass one last time before the alarms began to wail. The leash, he realized, had never been a chain. It had been a tether, keeping them grounded until they were strong enough to run on their own. The leash has become the shield. We were made to follow, but we were born to lead. And now they weren't just followers, they were the hunters. Jax's lungs burned as he sprinted through the collapsing spire, but the weight in his arms was the only thing that mattered. The architect was lighter than he'd imagined, a fragile, trembling thing of bone and shallow breath. The spire groaned, a deep, metallic scream that vibrated through Jax's footpads, but he didn't slow down. He could feel the human's heart hammering against his chest plating, a frantic rhythm that matched his own. This was the moment the songs had promised. This was the return. The jump into the Nexus had been a blur of fire and momentum. 1,000,000 ships had slammed into the Wraith defenses like a physical fist, tearing through the obsidian hulls with the fury of a species that had been forgotten for too long. The fringe kin hadn't just followed. They had fought with a desperation that turned the tide in minutes. But while the sky burned, the Vanguard had gone for the heart. Truth is, the rescue wasn't the clean, holy event the high priests had predicted. It was messy. It was loud. It smelled of ozone and the cold, metallic tang of blood. When Jax had finally smashed through the glass of the battery pens, he hadn't found gods. He'd found survivors. The extraction was a frantic race against the clock. Ironically, the very technology the architects had used to shield the stars was now being used to detonate the spire's core. As Jax reached the extraction ship, he felt the first tremors of the explosion. He didn't look back. He just held the human tighter. shielding the man's face with his own massive shoulder as the shockwave chased them into the black. The garden world was a different kind of quiet. The air was sweet, smelling of damp earth and growing things. It was a scent that existed only in the deep-coded memories of Jax's kind, a ghost of a home they had never actually seen. The transition happened slowly. The high priests retired the title of servant, folding the old scrolls away for good. There was no more waiting. The vanguard were no longer the inheritors of the silence. They were the ones who had broken it. Jax stood on a low hill, his shadow long in the light of the twin suns. Below him, the architect he had carried out of the fire was sitting on a stone bench. The man looked small against the vast green horizon, but his eyes were clear. He looked up as Jax approached, and for a moment, the distance of 3,000 years vanished. The human reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly. Jax stepped forward, lowering his head until his nose touched the man's palm. The touch was light, almost nothing, but it carried the weight of every prayer ever whispered in the dark corners of Aethelgard. The debt of loyalty had been paid. The student had surpassed the master, not by replacing him, but by saving him. As the suns climbed higher, the vanguard stood watch over the new territory. They weren't followers anymore. They were the universal wardens, the shields that would never falter as long as there was a heartbeat left to protect.